Hello, welcome to our latest episode of Breaking the Spell. On today's show, we have our lovely and very accomplished Sarah Ichioka, who is the author of an amazing book which we just read. It's called Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency, a book that she co-authored with Michael Pawlyn. Yeah. So Sarah Ichioka is a strategist, curator, writer, and the founding director of Desire Lines, a consultancy for environmental, cultural, and social impact organizations and initiatives. In previous roles, she has explored the intersections of cities, society, and ecology within leading international institutions of culture, policy, and research. Sarah's outlook is global, interdisciplinary, and future-facing. She has been recognized as a World Cities Summit Young Leader, one of the Global Public Interest Design 100, a British Council Clore Duffield Cultural Leadership International Fellow, and an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Raised in California and currently based in Singapore, she holds degrees from Yale University and the London School of Economics and Political Science. So welcome to our show, Sarah.
Thanks for having me, Unsu and Santosh. So happy to be here.
Yeah, no, we're very excited. I read your book and really loved it. The way I think about the book is to get all those ideas, you need like a library of 30 books, and you and Michael have somehow managed to condense all that wisdom and knowledge into a very slim and readable book. And unfortunately, I know you don't have a physical copy of the book because it's so fresh off the press.
I know. I literally last night got the message from our publisher that my books are on the way. So I just for good luck brought my last marked up proofs copy. But yes, hopefully by the time this airs, we will all have physical copies in our hand.
Yeah, but I think this is actually quite a treat for viewers because this is so fresh and new and quite exciting to dig into. I think the book was actually, what I liked about it was filled with a very serious sense of urgency about the times that we're in dealing with the climate and environmental crisis, but also filled with so much hope and possibility, and I really appreciated that balance. But before we get into the book, I'd like to ask you about, can you think of a time in your life when you first sort of felt the world wasn't the way it should be?
I love this question so much, and I understand that you ask it of all of your guests. And what I love most about it is that you use the word feel rather than think, because that brought up so many different responses for me. And I think I couldn't necessarily pin one example, but it has to do with early childhood experiences of disturbed landscapes. My family are very outdoorsy. They're very active hikers, campers. My father's an avid fly fisherman. So my brother and I spent most of our childhood holidays outside, like in the mountains, at the beach. And I just remember a series of being in places that just, you could feel the human impact on the landscape in a detrimental way. So just maybe two examples. One would be, I can't remember how old I was, but you're kind of walking through a forest and then coming to a sort of overgrown clearing where you could see the remnants of what was clearly had been a sort of settler cabin of some sort. And there were broken bottles, rusted metal, kind of what had been their tip. But then what somehow disturbed me the most there were these ornamental species of plants still growing, that far outlived whoever had abandoned the house, but somehow seemed so out of place in relationship to the rest of the ecosystem that we'd been traversing. And then one other example was my father and I, my father would always take me along every year to a beach cleanup of a local beach. And that as well, like being quite small, quite low to the ground, and suddenly just encountering all the flotsam and jetsam and detritus, and being able to like actively recognize, like, oh my gosh, that's the top of a pen that somebody dropped, or like that's a cigarette butt that somebody smoked, or that's, you know, recognizable pieces of detritus that had been carelessly left, and it ended up kind of becoming integrated with this ecosystem in a detrimental way. So those are two memories from amongst this series that I wanted to share.
Thank you. And actually, I think it's really relevant to your book. You know, what I thought was really good about your book, and I've read a lot of books on, let's say, climate crisis, you know, and how we need to refashion economics and move to a regenerative paradigm. But, you know, I understand you have a background in architecture, and, you know, very near the beginning of the book, you explicitly say that the book's focus is on the built environment. So yeah, I mean, already, you know, in those memories that you have, there's this tension between the built environment of humans and nature. And yet, I think I've read somewhere that you call yourself an urbanist.
Correct, yeah.
So I'm curious about that, like, you know, seeing that you have this fondness and love of nature, yeah, what draws you to the urban environment?
Great question. Yeah, so in terms of my co-author, Michael Pawlyn, and what we bring to the table is Michael's trained as an architect, and I'm trained, I read history first, and then I'm trained as an urban designer. So although I've always worked with architects, around architecture, I'm not myself a practicing architect. But I have always been really, yeah, I absolutely love nature, but I also love cities. I think I just love habitats generally, and thinking about how all the different pieces of them fit together. So whether that's, you know, whether that's what we would call nature out there, or human designed habitats. I'm just fascinated by both in equal measure, and I guess optimistically kind of hope there might be some reconciliation between the two. But yeah, it could seem in tension, but hopefully it's a fruitful tension.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I said, I think that was what was refreshing about your book, because it gave me hope that, you know, I mean, since the majority of humanity is now living in cities, and even more will be, it is really crucially important that we find a way to rethink our cities and bring our cities more in balance with nature. Yeah. So, you know, going back to the genesis of the book, like, how did you meet your co-author, and how did you decide on writing this book?
So Michael Pawlyn has been a colleague who's become a friend over the years. We met when we were both working in London, maybe about 12 years ago. And I think at the time, yeah, I think we met through some event. You know what it was? He had just left Grimshaw Architects. He had been one of the drivers behind the Eden project, which was, you could see as a precursor for projects like the flower domes at Gardens by the Bay, but it was regenerating an old quarry site, this new designed ecosystem that also had a social regeneration mission to it. And I was working in a series of programs that were about interpretation of architecture and cities for a broader public. So interpretation and engagement around architecture and cities. So we crossed paths that way. And then I think the bond really deepened when I helped him launch his best-selling book, Biomimicry in Architecture. We had a really lively public conversation about that, and I think realized we shared a lot of common interests. And then right before I moved to Singapore, the final exhibition that I initiated at the Architecture Foundation that I was running in Singapore was the first solo show of Michael's studio's practice. And then we just stayed in touch. But I think the touchstone for Flourish was a series of conversations we had in autumn 2018, where there were a series of events that came together in sequence that, for us, just raised a sense of urgency, I think along with many other people. But, you know, the publication that autumn of the IPCC's red alert warning, the report on 1.5 degrees C warming, and then the fact that concurrently, as we write in the book, at very similar time scales, a beautiful building in London was dubbed the world's most sustainable office building, and it won the UK's top architectural honor, the Sterling Prize. But when colleagues that we respect did the analysis on that building, the world's most sustainable office building, winner of the highest prize in the land, they found that it was consistent, the way it was built was consistent with the 3 degrees C temperature rise. So there was just this great disconnect between what we saw our built environment peers lauding as the ultimate achievement in sustainability and where the direction we're going kind of collectively as global society. Mm-hmm. So I don't know exactly when we decided to write the book together, but I think we thought, these are conversations that we didn't want to just keep to ourselves. We wanted to engage with others. And I think, and so I've heard you describe yourself as a bookworm. I think Michael and I are both definite bookworms, and thought that rather than just keeping those ideas to ourselves, we really wanted to share them and shout from the rooftops about some of these thinkers whose work that we'd read that really inspired us, that we thought that other built environment practitioners could benefit from. So it was also an opportunity to share that.
Yeah. That example of that office building, the Bloomberg LP building, really stood out for me. And it's at the beginning of the book, and it just made you realize our best efforts at dealing with this crisis are just not enough. Yeah. And you state that very clearly. And so for the benefit of viewers, I'm going to try and give like a 1 sentence or 2 sentence sort of summary of what your book really is about. And it really is about the need to shift from a sustainability paradigm to a regenerative paradigm. And I think that's a really important message, because a lot of people right now think, sustainability is enough. I think billions, if not trillions of dollars of investor money are going into, funds that approve of, ESG stocks, and that just is nowhere near enough. So it's that really, the whole book is about trying to explain the difference between these two paradigms, and by describing that, build a bridge where we can cross over. What do you think? What was your, takeaway of the book? How would you sum up the book for yourself?
Yeah, so there are 2 things that came to my mind in the book. It's an amazing book, and it's a compendium of wisdom from many other books. So I feel it's a must read for students, policymakers, philosophers, and thinkers. 2 things came to my mind. The first thing is Donnella Meadow's leverage points, and the places where we want to intervene in a system, where we want to either re-examine or transcend existing paradigms. And this brings me to the second point, which is technological change is not good enough. We need cultural change and a shift in our mindsets, and in my personal opinion, a spiritual shift, a spiritual reawakening of who we are as human beings. How do we see ourselves? So that's like my main takeaway. Donnella Meadow's points of intervention, or levers for intervention in a system, and then the whole series of change that needs to be cultural in very invisible areas, which require a slowing down and a rethink of the things that we hold dear to. And there were 5 chapters in the book, and if you might just help us go through a very short and brief summary of the 5 chapters before we dive deeper into some of the themes which we both found interesting, or which you might have found interesting that you would like to raise awareness of, that would be amazing, Sarah.
I'd be happy to. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank Santosh, because he was one of our esteemed first readers of the manuscript, and I think definitely some of the areas where we try to incorporate more spiritual concerns are definitely, you can trace back to Santosh's excellent comments at manuscript phase. So thank you very much for that.
Well done.
Yes, so Michael and I were very inspired by Meadow's leverage points. I'm not sure if your viewers will be familiar with her work, but obviously very influential systems thinker, one of the lead authors of the Limits to Growth report that came out of the Club of Rome. And there are so many, I think before I talk about the 5, I just want to quickly frame, Unsu, you mentioned it's about a transition from a sustainable paradigm to a regenerative paradigm, for sure. Partly because, as you have acknowledged, we don't want to sustain the current system, right? We don't want to keep going as we're going. We need to completely rethink it and replenish and renew. But also, Michael and I have been very concerned, along with others we respect, about how the term sustainability had become completely devalued since its first common usage in the 1980s. So basically, during my lifetime, this term, which started out with very noble ambitions, had been completely devalued. We had seen a real bubbling up of the term regenerative amongst colleagues. The term was drawn from agricultural practices originally. We'd seen many other disciplines beginning to use it and thought, actually, we can't let this become another sustainable, right? Let's think how we can define what sub-paradigms within the larger paradigm we can try to find some agreement with others might be kind of authentically regenerative. Obviously, one doesn't want to police boundaries, but I think trying to define what shared terms are can be very helpful. So briefly, the 5 themes we looked at were, the first chapter is looking at the paradigm of possibilism, which is really trying to think about moving from a paradigm of whether being an optimist or a pessimist, instead thinking about what could be possible with the information and the tools that we have or that we could create. And it links to an idea of how we can expand how each of us can expand our individual agency by thinking about ourselves as more than consumers, which we are very often taught to think about ourselves as, and then also thinking about co-agency with other people and groups. And then from there, we look at moving away from a paradigm that sees humans as separate from the rest of nature, and in many cases holding dominion over the rest of nature, and instead seeing us as an integrated part of nature. And the implications for designers in that instance is thinking not how do we protect nature or how do we defend from nature, but how do we actually design as a part of nature, which is a whole new, very exciting challenge to think about. Then so
that was your second chapter, right?
That's our second chapter.
Which is kind of about the co-evolution of humans with nature.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then chapter 3 is trying to move away from our ever-shortening horizon of short attention spans and just trying to deal with whatever's directly in front of us, to being inspired by many great thinkers who are looking at encouraging us to think about a longer term horizon, both looking backwards and forwards in terms of the implication of our actions. So that's what we call a longer now. And then the fourth paradigm is trying to move away from what we see as a degenerative paradigm of competition. One of the overarching themes through the book is the idea that we live metaphors, right? So we live metaphors, often not even thinking about them as metaphors. And that so often the way those metaphors borrow from various influences, but in many cases, we've tried to identify examples that are, in this case, an example borrowed from a Darwinian conception of evolution that actually has been somewhat replaced or debunked by subsequent evolutionary science, that of survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth and claw. There's always someone out there who wants to eat your lunch, to borrow someone else's phrase. And instead look at more current thoughts of evolutionary biology, which shows that a lot of life forms actually have their origins in the merger of other life. So we took the new paradigm that we want to work towards of symbiogenesis, which is the creation of something new through collaboration. And then the final one is looking at like what should be the driving purpose for our economies and our societies and our policies. And in this case, we're really inspired by Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, but also work by people like SEI, and we try to grapple with our human obsession with growth, and again think about the limitations of that metaphor, and instead are suggesting that a metric of planetary health might be the overarching goal that we should be aiming for.
Thank you for that map of the territory. I mean, each of those chapters contains an almost dizzying number of like thinkers and ideas and thoughts that I almost didn't know where to begin this conversation. But what I liked was I almost felt as if each chapter did have an anchor thinker, and I don't know if that's by accident or was intentional. But I can't remember if there was one for Possibilism, but for the idea of coevolution, I think you referenced Jeremy Lent a lot, who talks about patterns in history. And then for the long now, it was Roman Krasnick.
Krasnarich, yeah.
Krasnarich.
Yeah.
Who's actually Kate Raworth's husband.
Correct.
Right. So then
Oxford Mafia.
Yeah. And then for the fourth chapter, it was Lynn Margulis, who came up with the Gaia theory. So yeah, I kind of like that there was this, for me anyway, a central figure that helped to anchor each chapter.
Thank you so much for referencing those. And actually, just to give credit where credit is due as well. I think in terms of the first one, it was much more, we were trying to give examples of people who we thought were living this paradigm. So it's much more of a montage of various different actors who we see embodying this idea of expanded agency and possibilism, whereas you're right, absolutely. For the other four, there are some seminal thinkers who influence us, who we then try to illustrate subsequently. I also would like to talk about Freya Matthews for number 2. We think that she was really influential in that chapter. Let's see, who else? Also in the Symbiogenesis chapter, yes, absolutely borrowing the metaphors from Lynn Margulis. We're also really inspired by the philosopher Glenn Albrecht. And as well in that chapter, an eminent professor of African literature and culture called James Agude as well. A lot of his thinking about how kind of the contemporary practices of traditional philosophies have a lot to offer.
Something that came to my mind was this whole concept of emergency, and I feel we were the converted. We were clearly bought into the idea, but what I'm worried about is that we are in our own silo, and the moment you leave this room and you take the bus or you go into a meeting room, it doesn't seem to be an emergency, a climate emergency or ecological emergency. If you go to, let's say, the civil service and you have policy discussions, this is not an emergency right now. Like just in Singapore, COVID-19 is the emergency. And so what I'm asking myself is, what do we do to convert the unconverted. And there is a 3.5% that we need to convert if we want to reach a critical mass or tipping point beyond which everything will shift. So what do we do? Do we hold book clubs of your book? So do we hold readings of your book? And we do a meditation and an introspection, chapter by chapter, with people who are interested. So that's one thing that I was thinking of. Just introspect. I think it's a book of tremendous material for introspection and contemplation. That was how I felt I could contribute to converting the rest of society to the 3.5% that we want to achieve. Yeah. So what I'm asking myself is, why is it so oblivious to so many people out there that this is, like, to a lot of people out there, this is not an emergency?
Are you familiar with the psychological concept of, it's called pluralistic ignorance?
Pluralistic ignorance.
Well, I read it in your book. So
okay, so that to me is a really key thing to understand. So if you look so with the qualifier that as in so much Anglophone social science research, there's a very strong bias towards certain populations, in particular North America. So we have to have that caveat, but it's been pretty consistently found that in a lot of circumstances, people underestimate others in their communities' levels of shared concern for issues. Often, example would be university students often don't really want to drink that much themselves, but they perceive that their peer group want to binge drink, but they never raise it. Or similarly, it was shown, it's in subjects like racial equity during the civil rights movement, more white Americans believed in racial equality, but because they thought that their neighbors or their fellow citizens didn't, they didn't speak up about that. You can call that cowardice, but I also think there is something about sometimes we can have these innate feelings that something might not be right, going back to like, when did you first feel that something is wrong? But we are culturally conditioned to, don't be the downer, don't go against the grain, but by the very process of not sharing that sense that something is wrong and we need to do something about it, we are actually stopping ourselves from making a deeper connection with those who maybe the person next to you on the bus who's watching a BTS video on her phone is actually doing that because she's trying to numb her climate anxiety. So I think that one key step, which I know that organizations like Climate Conversations are trying to work on, is just fighting against this pluralistic ignorance, the sense that, well, I'm sure he doesn't care about this, so I'm not going to voice my concern.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. In fact, I think last year I just started an experiment on my own. When during the pandemic, you would catch up with people you hadn't talked to in a long time, and I just tried going, right for the gut, like telling people, I just look at the climate crisis, and I think in our lifetime we're going to see civilizational collapse, and I'm spending a lot of my time now trying to figure out what to do about it. And invariably I would actually, to my surprise, I would find a lot of people actually agreed with me. And that was surprising to me, because I would have thought that as you say, my views would be like very unpopular or would be quite a downer for people. So at this point, I actually feel quite a lot of people that agree that there's a crisis. And for me now, the next step is, do they think we can do anything about it?
Yes.
Because that's the next step. Because I'm at the point where I think we can. I think there's hope.
Great.
But I think a lot of people that I talk to are still at the stage where it's hopeless. What can we do about it?
For sure. That's why I think, you're a filmmaker, right? This is where I think that storytellers have such an important role to play. Michael and I were trying our best to translate these thinkers who inspire us in a way that we thought could be accessible by our target audience. We were also very keen to find examples of practical examples that could illustrate some of these higher level concepts. And I think that I think, Santosh, going back to your question, one of the things that we can do is we can seek out and spread new, more positive stories of people who are doing something about it. One of my favorite YouTube channels is run by Kirsten Dirksen. If you come across her work, she and her partner travel the world visiting intentional communities or people who are making these amazing lives off-grid or sometimes in the middle of cities, and just showing how it's actually, there are a lot of people doing amazing things and they're really enjoying it and the life looks beautiful. Like it doesn't shy away from the challenges that they face, but it just shows people inhabiting this new reality. Like they are making it happen, and at all different socioeconomic levels, geographies around the world. And I think the more that we can pair the discussion of these high level issues with practical examples of regenerative life being actively lived, that can really help to draw the imagination away from all of the kind of apocalypse porn that we're constantly bombarded with, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I really appreciate that, like, your first chapter was Possibilism. I mean, you know, if you imagine that you only have 5 arrows in your quiver, it's not many, and you chose one of them to be possibility, you know. I had a huge respect for that, because as you've observed, I was a filmmaker, and I've been to Burning Man many times, and that has taught me the power of the imagination, and it really has to start there. And I do feel that when I talk to a lot of different, you know, people like who get caught in resignation, it's because of a lack of imagination. They just can't see the possibilities.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think if you to just go back to my eyes lit up when you talked about pluralistic ignorance, because this is a social psychology concept that I've been studying for a number of years. And the antidote to pluralistic ignorance is actually modeling vulnerability, because the reason why people fear being the odd one out is because of the fear of abandonment and the fear of rejection. And so if we create a space where we can be vulnerable with self-disclosure of our fears, our deepest fears of being abandoned and rejected, if we raised or surfaced an inconvenient truth that challenges the status quo, and if we built a sufficient degree or amount of allyship where people who raise different opposing views, they are not sidelined or pushed to an outgroup, but they're rather accepted for the differences that they bring to the table, that is actually what we call the start of a real, authentic community. Yeah. So one theory of change that there is around here in Singapore, it's climate conversations, and we have a friend, Tok Sin Ying, who runs climate conversations, and their theory of change is really co-agency. How do we come together and just have a discussion? And they create a very safe, intimate, psychologically safe and intimate space for us to share our deepest fears of abandonment and fears of rejection, if we raised or surface an issue which is inconvenient to the rest of the group. Yeah, and that for me has been the crux of like my own conversations with people. It's okay if you raise an issue that's controversial or that does not fit with the in-group's way of thinking.
Yeah, I love that example. That was a real breakthrough experience for me here in Singapore, because I'd felt that in London, I'd felt like I had many like-minded friends who were really happy to, like Michael or others, who I saw eye to eye with on the issues, but it wasn't until someone invited me to climate conversations here. I actually cried with relief, in front of four people I'd never met before, because I was just so relieved to hear other people actually sharing their concerns, because I'd gone for 3 years, basically hearing no one in my circle of social acquaintance vocalize the concern. So it's a really great organization. I think another block that we need to think about how to overcome is the hypocrisy block. That I think that so often that is used to shut down initiatives, to say like, well, if you are not 100%, if you haven't gone vegan, you're only riding your bike, you're eschewing any, client who has any association with mainstream economy, that you have no right to say, to call out a problem or to try to propose solutions. And I think that that's a really false trap, because obviously if you're saying the problem is a systemic problem, by identifying that, you're saying yes, and we are all and we are all integrated into that system, so we are all in some ways culpable, but that doesn't that doesn't somehow mean that we cannot also identify problems within the system. But I don't know if you have any philosophies or theories of how we can break through that, but that's a block that I've definitely seen, that people will say, well, if you're not 100% pure, I don't want to hear a criticism from you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that, it's really trying to get away from either or thinking and towards both and.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, I can be living, a suboptimal lifestyle, and I can also aspire to something better and try and move people towards that. And I think maybe what you're also getting at on a deeper level is that shaming people is not a good way to go about moving things forward. And as a point of reference, I don't know if you saw the very heated encounter at COP26 between this Scottish activist, I can't remember her name, I think maybe Jane McDonnell, and the Shell CEO.
Yes, the IDEO curated climate.
But she pretty much walked off the stage.
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought that was a very interesting moment, and the moderator did a really good job of holding the complexity of that. And it's not about right or wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, she was being true to her own emotions.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can also see that, for the Shell CEO, that might really put him in a defensive posture. And in the end, I think that the end result of that was Shell actually canceled this project that they were going to do in Scotland as a result of this. And then there were these Tibetan monks, I think, who were there trying to create this space of peace. And what they observed is that the day after Shell canceled that, the activists wrote on social media, "We won." And they said that was a missed opportunity. Instead of claiming victory, they could have said, "Oh, we're grateful that Shell has moved in the right direction." So it's really just those subtle nuances of stepping away from finding someone to blame, needing to shame someone, and really just, I don't know, putting everyone's needs and wants and feelings on the table, and then collectively trying to nudge things.
I guess that's why, a just transition is going to be about creating the alternatives as well. I mean, my heart doesn't break too much for a chief executive of a oil and gas company, but I would certainly say that, all of the working class people who are trying to support families out on dangerous jobs on oil rigs, making profits for him, definitely, we have no right to shame them for what they do unless we can offer, dignified, meaningful employment that helps them to support their families and advance their position in life. So I think that it's about how do we create the alternative structures that everyone can migrate to, so we're not just saying you, but also look, here's this alternative. Now you have no excuse to continue as you are.
Yeah. I was wondering if we could make it, bring it, to our local context. We're here in Singapore.
Yeah.
And construction is a huge industry here. I mean, Singapore is the built environment. And one of the things I really liked reading your book was just this little fact about how concrete accounts for, I don't know, like 8% of carbon emissions. It's quite a lot.
Yeah.
And, also the fact that when humans, build things, we use every element in the periodic table, whereas nature only uses 4. Nature's pretty frugal about it. And then so it really makes us think like, could we kind of copy nature? And you mentioned coral as nature's equivalent of concrete. So, but I'm wondering if you were to look at Singapore, I mean, even after reading your book, I didn't even see how we could, have a different construction industry or have a different built environment. I wonder if you had any ideas or suggestions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the promising things about Singapore is that if it decides to do something, it can turn quite quickly, right? You can turn a speedboat quicker than a massive tanker. And there are some ingredients there that could make it possible. I mean, all of the amazing expertise and all of the money that's being poured into advanced manufacturing, for example. But it's just a matter of like bringing those different elements together and thinking like, what amazing new thing could Singapore offer the world? But it has to involve longer term thinking, right? They have to be able to get beyond the quarterly profits reports of all the big developers, or actually all of the SMEs, right? Who are like part of that construction ecosystem, who I'm sure are a very significant lobby. I think I see huge potentials in the regenerative movement, an alliance with the heritage movement here, that all of these passionate campaigners who are looking to preserve Singapore's built environment heritage for cultural reasons, actually there are tremendous environmental reasons, in addition to the cultural ones, to try to work with the existing structures we already have. And it'll be so interesting to see with the Golden Mile complex, right, what comes of that, and if that can help to, I don't know if we need to explain for international listeners what that is, but essentially this amazing icon of post-independent Singaporean architecture, which would otherwise have been due to be demolished, is now going to have a new life. Anyway, I digress a little bit, but the trying to work with so rather than just thinking like, what will this new technology that will save us would be, to also think, what do we already have, and how can we purposefully reoccupy and reanimate this in a way that precludes demolition, the like knock it down, start again that so many cities generally, but I feel like Asian cities in particular, have succumbed to. Some of the most interesting eco-villages that I've studied, for example, are working with repurposing older buildings rather than new build. So I almost see more potential in looking at what do we already have here that could be enlivened in a new way, rather than a new technology coming in to save us, per se.
You had I think, interesting anecdote in the book about this thing that was happening in London, like underneath this skyscraper. I'm thinking there might be some relevance about just working with what you have and creating new options. I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Of course. Thanks for bringing that up. That's one of my favorite projects. It's a project called Gibbon's Rent, and it was one of the examples that we used to illustrate the paradigm of symbiogenesis, of where all of these, a host of different partners came together to bring resources and creativity and love to transform what was a forgotten cut through behind our office and some residential buildings that was had become, it was kind of a place where you would just find lots of detritus from what happened the night before, walking through in the morning. Anyway, we came together to think about how we could reimagine it, and it wasn't anything big or shiny or fancy or designed by a architect. It was designed in collaboration by a young Australian architect working in partnership with a very seasoned British landscape designer. But it was how it came together that I thought was so meaningful, in that there wasn't even one overriding client. It was actually a collective group who came together. Some were bringing money, some were bringing, so the Business Improvement District was bringing money. We were, as a nonprofit, were bringing expertise and commissioning. All of the neighbors were active contributors to it. And it was installed and has subsequently been maintained by another neighborhood nonprofit who provide meaningful work for and a kind of a path to stable livelihoods for the formerly unhoused population in the area. So there were just so many layers and aspects that it's still a project that's unfolding, I'd say, over time, rather than just the 1 minute it's up, the next minute there's gray scaffolding around it, the next minute it's down completely to rubble, then something shiny and new goes up, and then every 15 years you repeat that cycle. It was kind of this incremental, collaborative way of thinking about how to change a shared space in the city.
Yeah, I like that. I wish we had more of that here in Singapore.
I think there is. I do think that there is an effort. I think that organizations like Participate in Design are really helping to build capacity around that. And it's a matter now of clients who are going to be landlords who are going to be willing to relinquish some of that control in exchange for a much more generative and eventually robust outcome.
In the social services sphere, there is this concept, it's called asset-based community development, ABCD, which resembles what we could do for the environment in Singapore. So we already have that in Singapore for social services in the social ecosystem. We can transpose or translate that into the ecology. You mentioned in your book a shift in the way we look at economics, and one very important shift is from the current paradigm of environmental economics to something more wholesome, which is ecological economics. Ecological economics has got economics nested within a social sphere, which is nested within a broader ecological sphere. Whereas the current model centers everything around economics. The environment and everything is at the service of economics. So a major shift in the way we even design and we model, we simulate, and we act on our economics in Singapore is another shift that I've seen in your book as well. Something else which is very interesting for me, it's the idea of democracy. And for democracy, what you had mentioned in your book, democracy is anthropocentric. It's human-centered. And we can shift to another form of Symbiocracy, which is exiting the Anthropocene and entering the Symbiocene. And when you talked about that, we had an earlier conversation where we could have a parliament where you don't just have voices from citizens represented through members of parliament, but the voices of nature in collective decision making for policies and laws. So you have seats in parliament, which are the voices of the trees and the ecology and nature. That would be so amazing. So those are some things that came to my mind as I was reading your book, which we can enact as shifts in Singapore.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful concept from Glenn Albrecht, the Symbiocracy. I wanted to tie together points that both of you made. So thinking about Singapore's current built environment and the potential for what it could be, and how that relates to economy and governance. I think that you'd sent a question ahead in advance about what the possibilities might be of creating urban eco-villages, which is a topic that I've had the great privilege of studying over several years in a dense city like Singapore. And when I was reflecting on that question, which I loved to receive, I feel like if you look at certain parameters, it's actually an excellent environment for it. The fact that socially people are accustomed to multi-generational living already, they're accustomed to shared facilities already, and spatially as well. I mean, the fact that we have all of these older buildings now, we have like all of these old strata malls, older HDB estates that have perhaps, to quote the late great urbanist Jane Jacobs, that, what is it? I'm going to get the quote wrong now. You're going to have to edit this. No, but basically saying that new ideas need old buildings to flourish. But what I thought the barriers to success might be are really economic and political. So a lot of the most successful urban eco-villages that I've structured built have a very robust civil society underpinning, right? And they also are, it's not just how they're spatially designed, there's also very clear new economic structures put in place. Many of them are owned as community land trusts, for example, or they're introducing new forms of governance that in many ways might be supplementary to other local government structures, or even like financial models, right? The Los Angeles Eco-Village that we write about has an ecological revolving loan trust that operates entirely on a trust basis. And I just wondered, knowing what I know about Singapore, whether those types of structures would be allowed to exist here, or whether they would be clamped down upon. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an open question. I think at the moment it's not looking promising for some of these new structures. But I'm in your book. It was a kind of a sidebar, but I think you talked about sociocracy and nonviolent communication as soft forms of just new governance models, and like important aspects of cultural change that need to happen. And that's something I've been quite obsessed with in the past couple of years. Like, I ever since coming across Sociocracy, like I've become convinced, yes, this could be the potential new operating system of, that's much more democratic. So, and I think in the book you also mentioned that organizations are like where sort of the scale at which change can happen perhaps most effectively. So I think that's where I think we can focus on, like individual organizations that are willing to make that change into, let's say, becoming a sociocracy or becoming a workers' co-op, exploring new economic models. Yeah. And then, that organization then becomes a proof of concept or model, which then others will give others the courage to follow. And if enough organizations then follow their model, then hopefully eventually government and society will sort of say, oh yeah, that's a much better way of doing things than what we have.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's only a small sliver of us who are bold enough to just be completely cutting edge innovators. And many more of us really like to have some the comfort of best practice or, transferable models. And that comes back to the idea of why people like the filmmaker Kirsten Dirksen, who I mentioned earlier, are so important in terms of showcasing successful examples that can be not exactly replicated, but modeled after and learned from.
In Singapore, there's this idea of the kampong spirit, which is really the eco-village that I've lived in overseas as well, and I've experienced several benefits, and it's been an amazing experience being in an eco-village. But what I see is the equivalent of an eco-village in Singapore is the kampong spirit. And so I think Singaporeans have found a way to integrate that into an urban environment. One example is a Telegram app, Scratchback, where residents within close proximity can state the items that they will be willing to offer, and then people who are placing their needs. And then there is a matchmaking process where offers and needs get matched, and neighbors within a neighborhood vicinity, they can interact and they can create an ecosystem of exchange. Or giftivism is another principle that I notice, especially in spiritual communities. So every Saturday I would attend classes on, let's say, the Bhagavad Gita, or I would go to the church and I would attend a lesson on the Bible. Within those spaces which are spiritual or religious in nature, the principle of giftivism is really real, and that's where shared and community is built. The kampong spirit comes alive again. So in the civil society sphere, like, there are also other areas in which we come together. We are part of the community development network. So we're here as what we call a mycelial network, a network of mushrooms in Singapore.
See, the metaphor is so important, right?
So I feel like we are part of an eco-village, but of a different sort. And in Singapore, we call this the kampong spirit. So that's very heartening to see that we actually have that, and we just need to shed light on what we already have. So this is the spirit of appreciative inquiry, where we shed light on what we have rather than get people to change. We meet people where they are.
That's a really nice framing of it. And to show how that's why I love we talk about the work of two architects who exhibited at the Philippines Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in the last cycle, who did extensive research into all of these different localized traditions of community building from around the world, including Gotong Royong. And I thought that was a really, really lovely example of taking contemporary inspiration from various very specific local heritages. So it did a nice job of showing there is, as Michael and I have tried to show in the book, there is something in us as humans that does want to collaborate, right? But then also to see how that manifests specifically in different places and how that can inspire our contemporary practices in those places.
We have some indigenous people. So when I was in secondary school, we were taken to Malaysia, just north of Singapore, and we met the Orang Asli. And in Singapore, you have, apart from the Orang Asli, the Orang Laut as well. And it was amazing to see that this indigenous people, who were very much our ancestors in Singapore, they had far superior and sophisticated technologies for living in alignment with nature. They had a sense of balance, a sense of reverence, a sense of regenerative or agriculture or sustainability that was far more sophisticated than what I went back to in the urban environment. And bringing students and children and adults on social tours to neighboring islands or neighboring countries where indigenous people still live, to bring to light the sophistication of their way of living and their way of life, is something that we can do in Singapore as well.
I'm so glad that you raised that point, because I think that's going to be one of the absolute keys. I mean, pretty much for all of underpinning almost all of the paradigms we discuss are learnings from traditional or indigenous wisdom. Absolutely. And I think that's something where all of us in the industrialized world have so much to learn or relearn. But the really amazing thing is how, despite all of the colonial programs of eradication, how there still are these continuous lived traditions and practices that are actually responsible for stewarding a large percentage of the living planet's remaining biodiversity. And I think what was something that I gained a lot in the research for the book was the appreciation that those practices are in marked contrast to this sort of John Muir conservation models that I had grown up believing were the correct way to you preserve nature by ring fencing it off and intruding on it as little as possible. But actually, there are all of these amazing, globally, these amazing practices of what Freya Matthews called custodianship or stewardship of active, fruitful, mutually beneficial interactions between humans and the rest of nature, which I thought we all need to relearn.
So, I mean, Santosh and I, we definitely have brought up indigenous wisdom a lot. And recently, I was just talking to a friend, and I think she might be representative of, a lot of people out there. But she basically said, yeah, a lot of people who talk about reviving indigenous wisdom, like they forget the fact that we now live on a planet of 8 billion people. Like those concepts or ideas just don't apply in this modern technological world with population. Like indigenous practices could not feed and take care of so many people. So I'd be curious what your response to that would be, especially since you clearly believe that we can make cities work, we can make huge populations work, and at the same time you think that we can bring indigenous wisdom into this.
Yep, so I don't think that we are going to be able to revert back to any, things have changed, right? But I think that is also, your friend's point is well taken. But at the same time as well, I feel like arguments like that go to population really obscure how deeply unequal our impacts are. So actually, if you look at the mess that we're in purely material terms, if you look just in terms of the top corporate polluters or the net percentage of people who, in places like Singapore, people like us in places like Singapore, who the footprint of our lifestyles, or more importantly, actually, these large corporations' footprints, saying that it's the problem of 8 billion people when it's actually the problem of maybe 10 million people. I'm getting my numbers wrong, but you know what I mean? There's this, it's actually about, if we could get right, if we could rebalance, it would go a long way towards redressing. There's this whole scarcity mentality that we only have because there is such a hoarding of wealth, an obscene hoarding of wealth in the concentrated hands of a few. But that said, yes, it's true. I think we will have to think about how we can integrate new technologies, but in the spirit of that wisdom. So maybe we will look at finding new ways of growing food that are integrated with architecture, but they don't necessarily have to be, with GM seeds and powered by LED lighting. And, I think there are ways you could do urban agriculture. You could repurpose the car park behind us for urban agriculture, but maybe you're actually growing moringa or other orphan plants that have been neglected in the globalization of our food sources. So they go back to a deep local species, local knowledge. So I don't see the two as totally incompatible.
Yeah, I think there was a point in the book when you maybe quoted Freya Matthews, but she talked about how with companies come up with an industrial process and there's going to be waste that goes into a river. A lot of companies are now thinking, okay, how can we, minimize the waste to minimize pollution? But then an even more radical question is to ask, what does the river want this race to be? And I thought that was just mind-blowing. I mean, to even, be able to pose that question, I think would be an amazing, start.
Absolutely. Matthews is brilliant. So that was a quote from her essay Towards a Deeper Philosophy of Biomimicry from about 10 years ago. And the two principles that she's identified as that we should be looking to emulate. So often biomimicry is misconstrued as being like a mimicry of the natural forms, but she's trying to go deeper into like the innate characteristics of natural systems. And she's identified two, one, conativity, which she defines as the impulse to maintain and increase one's own existence, and also the idea of least resistance, which is the idea of optimizing energy and resource use over time. And so it's a great way to follow on from your friend's comment, maybe. She's advocating that a deeper philosophy of biomimicry is one that imitates nature, quote, not in its particulars, but in its deepest logic. So how can we, when we're designing these new systems, think about how we're making ourselves integral to the existence of others, and also are comfortable asking them to do the same for us?
In the spirit of indigenous culture, where we see this happening and manifesting, and I got this from your book. It's an amazing excerpt, and it was one of the most meaningful excerpts for me, and I want to share this. So language is also very important. And I didn't know this before, but 30% of English words are verbs. Most are nouns, whereas in Potawatomi, it is 70% verbs. So the universe is actually a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects.
That's from Robin Wall Kimmerer, right? Yeah, and
absolutely.
And her phrase, which resonates with Matthew's conativity, is the concept of mutual flourishing, which we actually read Kimmerer after we decided on the title of the book. But I would happily say that it's a tribute. It's kind of a post-dated tribute to her work as well.
And as I went to research a bit more about her work, she's done work on mosses, which is amazing. They've got so much to teach us. If I'm not wrong, they've been in existence for 350 million years. So they are the most resilient, one of the most resilient of all species, and they've got so many things to teach us. Reciprocity, taking less than what you give is something that is evident amongst mosses. Staying together and being small. Those were like some lessons that she learned from mosses. Yeah. And this whole idea of communion of subjects is so beautiful, right? So what if we were just communion of beings? We are just communing together and no idea of possessions and objects. Yeah. So I think that was very, very touching for me. It touched me very deeply, and the next time I look at a tree or a river or a plant, that's me and that's another being like me. So that was particularly powerful. And she also said something in her article, what if we viewed mosses or the natural environment not as nature that's separate, but as kins. They're just relatives. They're really relatives. Some who have lived longer than us and some who are still alive. Yeah, not as ancestors or just relatives. Because that's how it's like in the Potawatomi language. They are like kins. And the moment we change the language, we change the underlying meaning of interaction and thus decisions possibly. So that was something really important that I took away from the book that I needed to highlight.
But I really love you highlighting those principles from Freya Matthews. When I read them, it really resonated with me, and it really connects with a lot of things that I'm interested in, in nonviolent communication. It's also about attending to the other person's needs. So you are making yourself important to the other person's life purpose. But then when you make requests, it's all very optional. It's not a demand.
Yeah.
You know, you are completely free to not meet my request, and there are many ways that you could meet what I need, right? So there's just a lot more fluidity, flexibility, and I really do like that idea of the, I don't know, is it the path of least resistance? Is that what she says?
Yeah.
And just to make things just easy
for
everyone to meet our mutual needs. I love that feeling. Yeah. I was wondering if we could touch a little bit on your third chapter about time, because I think time is such a huge component, and I'm saying this as you know, we've been spending quite a bit of time talking, and the time is just flown by. You know, like I've lost track of time. But yeah, it does seem to me that it was a well-chosen theme, and I think it's really critical, because I think in the capitalist structures that we live in, everyone seems as if we're running out of time, we don't have time, and yet things are very urgent, but we just seem to be making all the choices that keep us in the problem. So yeah, I was wondering if you could, talk a bit about your third chapter.
For sure. So this is the mindset of a longer now, and you've pointed out that it could be seen to be contradictory in the framing that Michael and I have chosen for the book, of saying like the time to act is now. We all need to expand our agency and do what's possible together, with the idea that Roman Krasnarich, or others like the artist Brian Eno, who also inspire us, and amazing colleagues like Ella Saltmarsh at the Long Time Project. Their idea of how we can expand our awareness of our position in a much longer time scale, and I think that in conveying that, I'll get back to the tension, but I think we found that in conveying this message, the work of artists is some of the most powerful that we've found. We're really inspired by artists like the photographer Rachel Zisman, who's traveled the world photographing some of the world's oldest living things. I mean, some of these clonal colonies of aspens that have been around for longer than recorded human history. I mean, these amazing, beautiful other parts of nature that have existed, that make our human lifespan like blip. But I think, I absolutely do think that exercises like those, like the tools that have been generated and shared by the Long Time Foundation, are really essential for all of us when we're facilitating group work or work with clients. But the way that I would see reconciling that longer time frame with the sense of urgency would be making the differentiation between my individual actions and the time that I have to make them versus their longer term context and repercussions, and being able to see how actually the time for me to act, the time that I am called to act is now, but I am called to act urgently and with impact now because it will have impact in the longer term. So it's trying to toggle between those 2 points, but almost seeing that we're part of this continuous chain of action that will have repercussions down the generations. But our ability, leaving aside spiritual traditions that consider things like reincarnation, that our time to act is like now. We have this precious time for ourselves, and that's where the urgency comes in.
Yeah, actually, I think that resonates with a lot of Buddhist teachings, right? Isn't Buddhism premised on the fact that being grateful for this one life that you have,
yes.
The fact that you're conscious, and the idea of karma is that your actions do have lots of consequences, and so you want to be very intentional about what you do.
Yes.
And yeah, and I think there was a great example in the book of this thought experiment of if you have a grandmother, and if you think of in her youth, she had known like older people, and then if you have a grandchild, and if that child grows up, and you connect that span of time, you personally would be kind of in touch with a time scale of 250 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I really love that image of, because we just think of our lives as like this thin sliver, but actually we encompass quite a lot of history. And if you think of 250 years, that's quite a lot. Quite a lot happens in human history.
Absolutely. If you just think about like the climate and biodiversity crisis, right? It's just, we've made that happen in that period of time. Mm-hmm. That's the human layers exercise, and I can't let this interview end without doing a plug for our podcast. So Michael and I, because we're bookworms, we love reading, but we know that not everyone learns from reading. We know other people have many different ways of learning, and so we're trying to relate in different ways. So we have a podcast, and we interview 7 different thinkers who've been influential in the book. And Roman Krasnarich is one of our interviewees, and he talks about using the human layers exercise with very powerful stakeholders, and how that actually gets to the position of vulnerability you were talking about earlier, Santosh, that suddenly when you get out of this immediate space and think about your relationship across those generations, that it suddenly opens up new possibilities in conversation.
Yeah.
Just last week I was doing a silent meditation retreat, and the first exercise is a death contemplation. And so we're meant to live. It's a practice. So imagine that we're just 3 hours away from death, and then slowly an hour away, and 10 minutes, and then what happens after that when you die, what happens during the death process. And as we emerge, we all emerge in like tears and with so much of gratitude for this precious life that we have. And it's so beautiful. I'm just going to look up the human layer existence. It's so profound. Contemplations on death, contemplations on our ancestors, our future generations, and it's so beautiful.
Another aspect of time that you touch on in the chapter, which I think is very important, is this idea that we think of time as something that is regular, linear, and quantified, and that actually this was something that was imposed during colonialism, and that if you look at lots of other different cultures, like indigenous cultures, they have so many different ways of measuring time. Like one great example was people that had a cent calendar. I think they're in India, and so they name different times of the year according to what smells you might smell, what floral fragrances you might smell at that time of year. And so it's that idea of subjective time, which to me is very important, because I think a lot of times you can spend a very short amount of time, but it could feel like a lifetime.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And to me, that is almost more real to me than objective time.
Yeah, completely. I'm so glad you brought that up. So that was from the research of Jay Griffiths, who wrote a fantastic book called Pip Pip, which is all about these different, much more qualitative, sensorial versions of time. And again, it's like, so time has been standardized and commodified so recently, actually. And I think that observations like Jay Griffiths as well help wake us up to other potentials of the ways of just experiencing the world around us, right? Like, so what does it smell like today? Or, and it relates to things like getting to know our local ecosystem again.
Yeah, so I read this essay called Tyranny of Time. It was in Noma, this website called Noma. And it really talked about how time is like this colonial imposition, and as an illustration, it said like time, a second is now defined as like so many, I don't know, pulsations of a cesium atom, right? But then in order to make that universal and objective, they literally have to keep this atom in a sealed, vacuum sealed room where no vibrations can enter, no sound, nothing. So they pretty much have to seal it off from the rest of the world. Like that's what you need to do to create objective time, right? Which I think is a great metaphor for what colonialism does. It's like, when I read that essay, I decided to do this experiment where, like, on a Sunday, from the moment I woke up, I refused to look at my watch or my phone, and I had to take care of my kids, and I refused to have lunch at a specific time. I would just wait till they told me they were hungry, and I managed to go through the whole day until like maybe 4:30 when I felt like, oh, I had to check the time.
Yeah.
And I thought it was close to 4:30, and when I looked at it, it was like 4:25. It was kind of bizarre how much I've internalized this clock. But what I did find from the experiment was that letting go of this need to track objective time, the day was actually much more pleasurable.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like I enjoyed my kids' company more. There wasn't this friction of feeling like we needed to be somewhere at a certain time. So based on this experiment, I really do believe that this fixation on objective time does limit our vision and does, as you say, I think, exclude so much experience that we could have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it's battling with like my journey in Singapore, having grown up here. It's a very industrial form of education. So everyone, the entire cohort with the same age comes in, primary 1 and then 2 and 3. And the main basis for progress is really time. It's all about time. Our lives were so centered around time, and then when I went to work, it was all about producing and output by a certain amount of time. Only when I left it all, I realized, wow, there's a new way of being and a new way of relating, right? Moments like this are worth living for, like just having a conversation, and yeah, so this is something that takes a lot of practice to get out of the old conditioning. I think the chains of the old conditioning are so strong that it takes a lot of effort to counter that through spiritual practice or through intentional meetings like this.
I also think that time spent out in the open sky is one of the best ways to, you're resynchronizing your body just not naturally, right, with the rhythms of the sun or precipitation. And also I've found a lot that it's easiest to achieve that sort of non-regimented flow state if you're out in the rest of nature, rather than an urban environment that it's quite, time kind of expands there.
Yeah. Anyway, speaking of time, we have run out of time, and it's been really enjoyable. And I don't really have a good way to pull together all the different threads we've gone through. I mean, all I can say to viewers is that we've only touched on a fraction of the many interesting ideas in the book, and I highly recommend people read the book. And then for the podcast, where can we find the podcast?
I will give you all the information to drop into your show notes. But our website, flourish-book.com, it will be the key portal to get into all of our events pages and to track to our podcast as well.
Okay. Did you have any?
Yeah, if there is just one concept that I felt was worth debunking, because this is breaking the spell.
Yeah.
So we break spells here. It's a spell of success, especially in society, and I felt really compelled to share this excerpt from the book. And so this is what I read from the book, and I took it verbatim. Success isn't pursued by selecting superstars and seeing which is the last left standing. Instead, true champions are fiercely protective of the principle that no one gets left out and that no one else pays the price of success. Success is only meaningful when everyone owns it. Yeah, so I think that was something else that I felt very moved by in your book.
That's from Margaret Heffernan, who is incredible. Everyone should read Margaret Heffernan, who's one of the key sources for the competition to symbiogenesis. And she offers, with her like amazing journalistic, vivid descriptions, offers fantastic examples of so many thriving organizations that are following that principle instead of the old degenerative paradigm of competition.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And
thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.